If you're part of our church, you will have seen two pictures this week pop up on the church WhatsApp, if you're still on the church WhatsApp. The two pictures were one from almost 6 years ago of a little group of people just before the launch of Gracemount Community Church, who formed the initial little planting group, like 15 or so people in that picture. I think there were, in the mansion. I wasn't there. Was it in Liverpool? Held together in Liverpool back in the spring of 2017. Andy looking even younger than he does now, unbelievably. All the rest of you looking all of the 6 years older, except the heirs, who look just exactly the same as they did then. 15 people gathered together. The second photo was the one that we took last weekend at our church weekend away, our first ever church weekend away as Gracemount Community Church. There we see a picture of almost 85 people spread out across the grass in front of the Windmill Centre. And clearly, as we looked at those two photos, it's clear God's been really good to us. God's been good in the way that He's given growth numerically to our church, and in the way that He's kept us gathered together in unity as a church. Small beginnings have grown into really sweet blessings by God's grace. Amen? Now, over these past number of weeks, as we've been going through Chronicles, we said that the first readers of this book were the post-exile community of God's people. These were people who had experienced the defeat by their enemies of their nation. These were people who had experienced the destruction of their temple by their enemies. These were people who had experienced the displacement of themselves as they were carried out of their land into slavery in a foreign land. At last now, these people were returning home. Now, these were people who could look back on their history and see seriously small beginnings. These people could look back at a guy called Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and they could see this tiny little group of people who had started things off for this nation. But small beginnings give way to sweet blessings. That's the story of the life of God's people. So as they read Chronicles, these post-exilic people, it's like they're looking back on that photo from last weekend. And as they look back on that photo from last weekend, they can see all of the people that God has added to their number. They can see the peace that God has given to them in the land that they called home. And they can see the plans that were put in place to build a temple in their midst where God would dwell with them. They were looking back at blessing, serious blessing. Chronicles presented them with the blessings that they had received by God's grace. But as they return to their land, to their home, their present reality feels far from blessing. Because the thing that's much bigger in their memory than blessing is the remembrance that God's special presence had departed from amongst them. Even before their temple had been destroyed by their enemies, their temple had become desolate because God had told them He would not dwell in the midst of people who worshipped other things instead of Him. Now, chapters 23 to 27 of 1 Chronicles, if you've had a look through it over the last day or so, chapters 23 to 27 look really daunting in some of the same ways that chapters 1 to 9 looked daunting. Now, if you remember what we saw in those first 9 chapters of Chronicles, we saw lists upon lists upon lists of names that we said painted 2 pictures for us. Remember the first picture that they painted? Don't be shy. Andy Prime is preaching, so that's fine by me. Yes, Alan. First one was a tree. We said the first picture was a tree. He's going to give you a prize afterwards. A family tree, we said, was the picture. A family tree. These were family names being read by what was left of the family as they returned home. And we said this was a tree that over time had become wintered and weathered. They were feeling a bit like most of us last Friday night, our weekend away. Wintered and weathered. But they were looking back on these names and seeing that they were once fruitful and flourishing because they had roots that went really deep into the faithfulness of God. A tree. The other picture, Alan, you told us was an assembly, a great gathering of people. And as the exiles returned to their home in dribs and drabs, small in number, they were shown by these lists that God had once gathered a great assembly of people around the worship of Him. Now, 1 Chronicles 23 to 27 is another record of a family tree at the time of another assembly. That's what's going on. Now, I wonder, as you looked at these two pictures of Gracemount Community Church, not the two pictures from 1 Chronicles 1 and 9. If you looked at these two pictures from Gracemount Community Church this week, what was it you were seeing? Well, in a very real sense, what you were seeing was a tree, a family tree, that started pretty small, but that has grown. And in another very real sense, what we're seeing in those two pictures is an assembly. Two assemblies, actually. One in Libertus, and one outside on the grass in Arbroath. Now, if you were to go out into the street and ask most folk what a church is, they're probably going to give you an answer, which is one of the things we don't have. What are they going to say? Building. And so we as Christians and part of Gracemount Community Church, we go to kind of great pains to say, no, a church isn't a building. A church is more like a tree. It's a family. And a church isn't a building. It's more like an assembly. It's a gathering of God's people. Those two things are true. And yet, as Chronicles has gone on, and especially since chapter 17, probably the dominant picture that has come to us in these chapters has been that of a house. We've seen a king called David, whose great desire was to build a house for God. And then we've seen God promise to David that, no, I am going to build a house for you. This promise of a house, it was the promise of a family. It's the promise of a tree. And it was also the promise of a kingdom that would gather all of God's people around God's chosen king as this great assembly of his people. It would grow and it would gather, but as it did so, this had to be a household that was governed by the promises of God. That's what we're going to see in these chapters today. King David preparing for the building of God's house by organizing the people of God according to the promises of God. That's what's in these chapters. As we look at the present picture of GCC, whether that be today or whether that be last weekend, and we see the gathering of worshippers that has been growing, we want to heed the warning that comes to us as these exiles return home to temple rooms. And we want to ask ourselves this morning, how do we ensure that we don't become just an empty house that eventually becomes nothing? How instead can we continue to gather and to grow and be fruitful all to the glory of God? That's the question. And so come with me to 1 Chronicles 23. We're going to see in these 5 chapters of lists that echo those lists at the beginning of Chronicles, a new beginning for the people of God. So if you look at verse 1 of chapter 23, this is what it says. When David was old and full of days, he made Solomon his son king over Israel. This is what we see first of all. David makes his son Solomon king over the people. Now we find ourselves this week in Scotland in the middle of a transition of power, haven't we? Nicola Sturgeon's resigned. The hunt is on for her successor. A similar kind of transfer of power is taking place here at the start of chapter 23. Only this time there's no vote on the matter. God's appointed, chosen king makes his son the king after him according to God's promise. As we saw already, didn't we, that God had said that Solomon, David's son, would reign after him, and Solomon, his son, would build a temple in years of peace. David's years had been full of war. Now his years are full, And so the man of war is here handing over the reins to a man whose very name means peace. Now, Solomon would be the house builder, but David has been the one that's been making preparations for this house. David's the one who has led the people in defeat of their enemies, bringing peace to the land. David's the one who has been stockpiling resources and materials for the building of the temple. And now there's one more piece of work to do. Have a look at verse 2. Having made his son king, David assembled all the leaders of Israel and the priests and the Levites. David gathers the assembly together, all of the people from every sphere of life in Israel gathered together. And look at verse 3, this is what he does next. The Levites, 30 years old and upward, were numbered, and the total was 38,000 men. And the Levites of working age in Israel were counted up. David gets a sketch in numbers of what the family tree looks like. Now, why might alarm bells be ringing for us at this point? What happened the last time David tried to number the people? Chapter 21, right? David tries to number the people, and what happens? Branch of the trees cut down. 70,000 men of Israel fall dead. So what might be different this time? That's the question. Well, as we look at verses 4 to 6, it goes on. 24,000 of these, David said, shall have charge of the work in the house of the Lord. 6,000 will be officers and judges, 4,000 gatekeepers, 4,000 shall offer praises to the Lord with the instruments I've made for praise. And David organized them in divisions, corresponding to the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. David's motivation this time isn't to kind of evaluate how strong have I become. David assembles the people, counts the people, in order that he might put the house in order. That's what's happening. He knows that his strength is behind him. He's old at this point. He knows he's going to die soon. He gets the people together, and his desire is to divide the people that the house might be put in order. As you hear house, don't go thinking like 3-bedroom house with Gracemount, okay? 13 Gracemount House Drive, not that kind of house. Try and get in your head Windmill Centre back in the day. Massive house, loads of rooms, lots of work to be done, and lots of staff that are needed. Someone had to organize the thing. Someone needed to clarify the structure of this new community of peace that God was establishing in Israel. Now, if you've been using the daily worship sheet with us in church, you've been reading through Genesis for the last couple of weeks. And if you think back 2 weeks ago, we began at the beginning, which is a good place to begin. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And we saw God create something out of nothing. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, though, we saw that the earth that God had created was empty and formless. And so it says God filled up the emptiness with his creation, and he brought order to the formlessness by separating what he made. And so God divided the light from the dark to make day and night. God divided the clouds from the sea to make the sky. God's work of creation was a work of putting in order by division. If there's one repeated word in these chapters of Chronicles that defines these chapters, it's the word divide. As David puts into place something new. Now, a couple of times in the last few weeks, there's been a fire alarm in the high school in Gracemount. I know that because my study window overlooks the football pitch to the side of the high school, and that's where everyone gathers if a fire alarm goes off. And so a couple of times we've seen this big wave of people coming out of the high school, over the hill, out onto the football pitch. And it looks like chaos. But over time, the kids kind of sort themselves out into classes, all standing in lines. You can tell which the naughty classes are at that point. Mostly standing in lines, with a teacher standing at the head of each line. The question is, why do they do that? Well, they do that because it's important to have an idea of who's there. You need some sort of order to know that no one's been left back in a burning building. There's safety for the assembly in order. That's the point. One of the things that me and Claire have been watching over the last wee while on the TV is Jeremy Clarkson's farm. Don't know if you've seen that. I think it's great. It's really informative, actually. One of the things I've learned is about an art called hedging. Ever heard of hedging? Yeah. So you know these bog standard hedges you have run alongside fields? They don't all look like that. Okay? Hedges, basically lots of trees planted quite close together along the side of fields. Hedging is when you come along and you know about this, Tammy? Yeah, you've done it before. You split the trunk of each one of the hedges, hedge trees. You split about 80% through. And then the farmer bends the trunk over and kind of weaves it and interlinks it with the hedge trees on either side until it creates this kind of hedge fence hybrid that's impenetrable by sheep. That's the point. You can make something orderly out of this bog standard fence. And when divided and when put in order, these hedge trees properly perform their function of keeping the livestock in. It looks really cool. You should look it up. Now, as David continues to prepare for the peace of Solomon's reign, he divides up the people in order to ensure their safety in properly performing their purpose as a people who glorified God. That's what they were there to do. This was an entire nation who had been set apart for that very purpose. It's a nation who were supposed to glorify God, and that's true of God's people today too. If you're a Christian today, you are a set-apart person. You're part of a set-apart people called the church, and you've been uniquely created to know God and to make God known. And the God that we know, the New Testament tells us, is not a God of confusion, but a God of peace. Now, there is loads of detail in these chapters, like scary amounts of detail. If you've got one of these sheets, have a look at the other side. I put this here. It's a detailed outline of the whole 5 chapters. When I showed this to Josh Hamilton yesterday, he said, "Oh my." That's his response. There's a lot of detail. The point, I think, in all of this detail is this. David is very careful and very precise in the way that he divides up the people. And as a church in Gracemount, as we thank God for the growth that he's gifted to us, and as we look to continue gathering under King Jesus to worship our God, we want to be just as careful and just as precise as David in ordering our life together, so that over the long haul, the main things remain the main things, and we don't just become an empty building or a community club without Christ. We want to be precise and we want to be careful. In Chronicles, every single time a good king ascends to the throne and there's a renewal in the relationship between God and his people, there is a return to this pattern of things that David lays down. These chapters illustrate for us, therefore, the enduring priorities for the household of God to make sure that it is built for his glory as we rejoice in growth and not for our glory. All right? Now, there's 6 of them, which is scary because we're like 15, 20 minutes in. But we're going to go rapid through these 6 things. And we're going to see in these 6 things the enduring priorities for the household of God. That's where we're going. Here's the first one. The household of God must maintain focus on the worship of God. The first thing that David brings to us is the temple staff. Now, if you look at verses 3 to 6, the men that David counts up are Levites. Now, the Levites were one of the 12 tribes of Israel, descended from this guy called Levi. This is the priestly tribe of Israel. Within this tribe of Levi was a subgroup who had been set apart to be priests. These were people who were dedicated to the worship of God, to the service of God on behalf of the people. If you look at verse 13 of chapter 23, you'll see that the priests were the descendants of Aaron, a guy called Aaron. Set apart, it says, for priestly service. Now, in verses 4 to 6, David divides up the Levites into departments, listed in size order. You see that? So we saw 24,000 for the work of the temple, 6,000 for officials and judges, 4,000 to be gatekeepers, and so on. But not only was the largest group to be those who served in the temple, the first thing he deals with is those who are to serve in the temple. In chapters 23 and 24, David is careful to set in order the staff for the worship of God. David makes very sure everybody knows who the priests are. Everybody knows what the priests are supposed to do. And he makes sure there are plenty of other helpers, called Levites, to help the priests in the work of the temple. Look at verse 28 of chapter 23. The duty of the Levites, it says, was to help the priests in the service of the temple. That's why they're there. The unbuilt temple at this point, the unbuilt temple, David makes really clear, is to be the priority of national life. The service of sacrifice was to be right at the center. David divides the priests and the Levites into rotas. So when David or Mark send you a spreadsheet with a rota on, it's got a biblical precedent. He divides the Levites and the priests up into rotas so that temple service was always available. No sinner would ever come to this temple and find there was no priest on hand to offer a sacrifice for their sin. Now, Christians, like you and me, we don't live under the same conditions as this nation, Israel. But what does remain just exactly the same is the absolute priority of the worship of God. The details might be different, but still, God is to be worshipped because he is a holy God. Still, God is to be worshipped because he is a sinless God. And still, God is to be worshipped because he is a merciful God who welcomes sinners to come to him. But sinners can only come to him because sacrifice remains at the center. Not animals or birds like in this temple, but the once-for-all offering of the Lord Jesus Christ on the cross. The only way for sinners to offer proper worship to the sinless God is through the sacrifice of Jesus for our sin. And so you need to know this morning. If you've never come to Jesus before, but you've come to church, it is impossible to please this God without faith in the cross of Christ. No one can do it. It's impossible for anyone to come and worship God without coming through him. And for the household of God, his worship has to be our chief concern, which means the cross of Christ must be at the center of everything that we do. The basis of our coming to God is the cross of Christ. The message we ought to have always available to anyone who comes is the cross of Christ. Because sinners separated from God by their sin can, through this cross of Christ, become set apart for him. That's the wonder of the gospel. Welcomed into his household, able to draw near to God, every believer a priest, able to come to God with no other mediator needed apart from the man who died on the cross and rose from the grave. That's what the cross of Christ has achieved. Every believer welcome to worship by the word of the cross. The household of God must keep Christ crucified as our primary message and the worship of God through him as our primary purpose. With me on that? That's the longest one. It's the biggest one. Okay. It's why we exist. Here's the second one. Sing the praises of God. The next group of people that David addresses and sets in order are the singers and the musicians. It's the whole of chapter 25. It's important. It's a repeated theme in Chronicles. Because though they weren't the second largest group, do you see that? They're not the second largest group. They are, though, the second group that David sets in order. They were set apart, verse 1 of 25 says, for the ministry of prophesying accompanied by music. In other words, these people were to declare truth about God and from God in song. They were to thank and praise God, it says in verse 3. With skill, it says in verse 7. And all of this was to be done under the supervision of the king. Verse 2 tells us. There is something about the household of God, when it is governed by the promises of God, under the leadership of God's King, that responds in beautiful, skillful, thankful song. It's important. Now, we're really, really blessed as quite a small church to have some people who've been gifted to us by God, who are trained and skilled in music and song to help us as we sing to Him. Aren't we? We're really blessed. But we should make no mistake that Saul and Carly and Chris and Sally and Andy and whoever else it might be, these aren't our singing leaders. They're gifts from God to us, but King Jesus is our praise leader. He's the one who leads us in singing. It is part of following Him. David was the king who wrote almost half of the Psalms. He was a poet and he was a musician. He was a singing king. And in just the same way, Jesus too is a singing king. He's the one who leads us to sing. It's part of our life of following Him, to sing in light of His sacrifice for our sin. And from David to today, into the whole of eternity, it will always be a priority for God's household to sing on the basis of God's promises made and kept in the Lamb who was slain. Always and ever. Priority number 2. Here's the third one. God's household must humbly guard the house of God. If you look into chapter 26, verses 1 to 19, we see the gatekeepers. Now, these people weren't at the front. These people weren't at the forefront of things. These gatekeepers, it says, would spend the night stationed around the house of God, guarding it, and they had the key for opening up in the morning. That was their job. They probably heard the music inside. Probably they were singing along. I think probably their favourite song that the priests, the Levites inside would have been singing would have been Psalm 84. I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. That's their song. Speaks to their experience. But these guys' job was important. These people were responsible for keeping the temple free from anything that would defile it, anything that would hinder the work of sacrifice and singing that was taking place within it. God's house was to be a holy place. Sinners were only welcomed through sacrifice. And for us today, we need to see in chapter 26 of 1 Chronicles that there is an enduring work of gatekeeping to be done amongst you and I as members of this church, as part of this part of the household of God. The message of Jesus is held out to anyone and everyone as a sufficient sacrifice for sin. Come and take it. Come to Him. And yet sinners are only to be welcomed into this household through His sacrifice. It's why baptism, it's why church membership, it's why church discipline, it's why the Lord's Supper are really important things. And the responsibility falls to you and to me as members of this church to ensure that the household remains pure. It's really important. Without any sense of superiority whatsoever, we are only doorkeepers. Doorkeepers. But we are to humbly guard the household of God. That's number 3. Here's number 4. The household of God is to lovingly care for the least and the last children of God. Second half of chapter 26 concerns the officers and the judges David puts in place. Now, these people were in charge of the treasuries and the territories. That was their job. And David sets them in place partly to show care for those parts of Israel who didn't live within easy reach of Jerusalem. Verse 32, have a look at that. The Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh. These were isolated tribes. These were tribes out on the edges. These were the ones who found it difficult to come to the house of God. These were the ones who were more prone to the influences of the unbelieving world all around them because of their isolation. David wanted to make sure no one was overlooked in the household of God. No one forgotten. No one lost. He put officials in place It says in verse 32, for every matter pertaining to God and for the affairs of the king, his people he wanted to be cared for spiritually and cared for physically. This remains a crucial priority for our church. To lovingly care for the least and the last, the ones who are most easily overlooked, the ones who are most vulnerable to being lost. And that's never been easy work. These guys, they were off on the road, they were traveling all over the place, they were enduring a lot of toil, away from the temple, away from Jerusalem, going right out to the far reaches of the kingdom. Caring is tiring, is the message. It always has been. And yet, if you were with us for our church AGM at the end of last year, Andy read to us from Galatians chapter 6, and this is what he read. Let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due time we will reap a harvest if we don't give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the... Tell me? Household of God. You're awake, that's good. Being a household involves caring, even when it's costly. Here's the fifth one. God's household must be ready to defend the honour of God. As we switch into the last chapter, chapter 27, he moves away from the Levites and he moves into the other tribes. The first chunk of people he looks at are the military leaders. These were mainly the royal bodyguard. Now, David here, he's not being self-protective. He knows he's about to die. This isn't for his sake. David here is in the process of handing over the crown. But David knew, and he knew from early in his life, that an attack on God's king was an attack on the God who made him king. And David knew that the honour of God in the world was bound up with the house of God that David's son, the king, would build. The people had to be ready to defend the king. Now, it's really easy for us today to think that for us, defending the king must mean making a case for his will and his ways in the world. It's really easy for us to think defending the king is to speak up for him out there by making a case for biblical ethics, for biblical morality, by making a case for the place of the church in society. Now, those things might be a part of it, but let's be really clear. The most significant way that you or I will defend the honour of the king is in dealing with our own sin. The conduct of his people reflects on him. What's the first thing folks say when a Christian falls? I thought you were a Christian. I thought you were a Christian. And they've misunderstood in that moment, because being a Christian, it's not about being perfect. But we should see in that moment that when we wear his name, when we stick up our hand and say, I am in the household of God, the way that we live, if we live as an enemy of God, should trouble us, because we bring dishonour to the name of God. And so the household of God needs to be ready to be radical about dealing with our own sin in order to defend the honour of God. Here's the last one, number 6. The household of God must live all of life to the glory of God. The rest of chapter 27 is a group of people who are civilian leaders. These are people in all different areas of national life, ordinary things, growing crops, raising livestock, giving advice to others, providing food for the household. The point is this: every area of life is to be lived in service to the king. And when every area of life is lived in service to the king, everything can be done just as much to the glory of God as the service in the house of God. There's a whole bunch of different things that those of us in this room spend our time doing. All kinds of things. Ordinary things. But if the cross of Christ is our centre, then the cross of Christ will shape everything in our lives, and all of our lives can be lived to the glory of God. Whether we eat or drink, or whatever we do, do it all to the glory of God. Now, imagine Imagine we get a building right in the middle of Gracemount tomorrow. Be good, right? If we got a building right in the heart of Gracemount tomorrow, but we neglected these principles for how God's household is to be ordered, that building would, in pretty short time, become just an empty house and eventually just a bare patch of earth. But if we were to fill that household with people who, living in the grace of the gospel, governed by the priorities of the gospel, trusting in the promises of the gospel, we would see God build his household, make his home in a place like Gracemount. And that would be better than a building, right?